Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. In addition to beating tigers and catching flies, China's anti-corruption campaign has rolled out the Skynet operation to target economic fugitives on the run abroad. China has issued global warrants for the 100 most wanted corrupt officials. At the top of the list is Yang Xiuzhu, former deputy mayor of Wenzhou City in Zhejiang province. She's now in U.S. custody after being caught with a fake Dutch passport and could be deported to China. Observers are lauding the arrest as evidence of strong cooperation between the U.S. and China on law enforcement. But is the U.S. likely to seal an extradition treaty with China? What problems has China run into in hunting these so-called foxes? And what are the remedies? Today, we are joined in the studio by Mr. Edward Lehman, Managing Director of the Lehman, Lee & Xu law firm, and Mr. Tao Jingzhou, Managing Partner of Deckard LLP China Practice. And we shall also talk to Mr. Michael Zhang, an attorney at law in the U.S. through telephone. Before we go to our panel, let's look at this. Yang Xiuzhu, called the Queen of Corruption, is China's most wanted fugitive abroad. She has been on the run for more than a decade and is set to be extradited from the U.S. Yang, a former official from Wenzhou, East China's Zhejiang province, is suspected of embezzling the equivalent of $40 million. She reportedly entered the U.S. using a fake Dutch passport last year. It's unclear how U.S. authorities managed to detain her. American law enforcement officials reportedly received information about Yang's identity from their Chinese counterparts via a U.S.-China forum on hunting fugitives. Beijing had previously filed an arrest warrant for Yang through Interpol, a global policing organization comprised of 190 member countries. The U.S. has extradition treaties with half. China is not one of them. And Beijing has been pushing for talks with Washington on changing that. But opponents in the U.S. say China would not guarantee defendants like Yang a fair trial. Regardless, Yang could still end up back home. If it's deemed she illegally entered the U.S., authorities are likely to kick her out. A statement by the U.S. Immigration Agency said Yang was pending removal to China for violating the terms of the visa waiver program, adding that as a foreign law enforcement fugitive, Yang is a priority. Yang Xiuzhu is the third person to be arrested from a list of 100 most wanted economic fugitives that was published in April. 1 month after the list was published, one suspect was arrested in China, Dai Xuemin, who is accused of embezzling 11 million yuan, and another, Li Huabo, a former local official in Jiangxi province who is accused of embezzling 94 million yuan, was extradited to China from Singapore. Welcome to Dialogue, gentlemen. No extradition treaty has yet been signed between the U.S. and China. So from the point of legal or judicial assistance, what do you think of the difficulties lying ahead for Yang Xiuzhu to be deported to China?
Since there are no treaty, therefore there are no obligation from U.S. government from a treaty standpoint. So it's really a bilateral discussion to see whether this lady has breached U.S. law so that they can be, deported to China.
She has indeed violated the visa-related application procedures. In that case, do you think this would be used as an excuse for her to be deported?
It's a possibility. I mean, so when you come into the country under a false passport, which is what she did, a Dutch passport, then that would be illegal. But she would have to go through due process. So we have that in the 14th Amendment. The question is, where would she be deported to? I mean, that's the question. And like Tao Jingzhou said, is that whether to send her back to China or send her back to Canada, which is where she was in the last place. Now, that would obviously, she might have entered there illegally as well. And so I think part of this is persuasion. There is no obligation, like Tao Jingzhou said.
But here is a pervasive mood in China that she's most likely to be repatriated, since there is a general consensus shared by the U.S. and Chinese government that economic fugitives should be brought back to justice. Therefore, does it say automatically, Tao, that the U.S. is, after all, prepared to send back the fugitives at large?
No, it's only allegation. There are presumption of innocence. Mm-hmm. So I think all these people are going to exhaust the legal remedies and the U.S. law, try to delay this possible, repatriation to China.
Well, let me cross over to Michael Zhang, attorney at law in the United States, for his comment on the prospects for Madame Yang Xiudu to be deported. Hello, Michael.
Hello, Yang Ray. How are you?
Fine. What do you think of her chance to be sent back to China and face an open trial?
I think there is some chance, and although I agree with your other guests, because we still need to find her identity. I mean, was she a national of China? Was she a national of Holland? Was she a national of Canada? And although she entered the country, the United States, with at least she's charged with entering the country with a fraudulent visa or passport. So therefore, the so-called due process and 14th Amendment give her some protection, but not that much. At least not as sufficient as the 14th Amendment and 4th Amendment given to a regular American citizen or a permanent resident. So I think this is a good starting point for U.S. and China to cooperate and to file charges against her with immigration violations. It's always a easier beginning point, but whether she will be repatriated to China or to other countries, that remains to be seen. I'm almost certain that her attorney is going to file application such as asylum or other immigration protections for her. She's going to try to use whatever possible immigration reliefs that she might be eligible in the immigration court in the United States. So it's a good beginning point, but I see it's probably going to be a rather lengthy process for her.
A question for three of you, gentlemen. Do you think repatriation of Yang Xiudu will serve as an example? Its symbolic meaning is unquestionable because United States, Canada, and Australia have been considered the three most popular hideouts for economic fugitives. Now, if this woman topping the list of 100 foxes who are what we call the corrupt officials fleeing China with a huge amount of money, and if Yang could be brought back, the others would probably be persuaded to come back one after another. What do you think of the symbolic implications here?
It is certainly very symbolic if the number one were not able to be, deported to China, face charge. I think Chinese government must concentrate their effort, try to use the legal mean and their persuasion power to convince U.S. immigration officers and other judicial bodies, try to see whether they can get her as quickly as possible.
Perhaps to clear the way for Yang to be deported, the first and foremost thing between the U.S. and Chinese government would be to sign the extradition treaty. What are the obstacles to signing up to this treaty?
Yeah, I think that would be probably beneficial, but the issue is that you better watch out what you ask for, because once this treaty might be put into place, it's going to be working both ways, and then it becomes in essence an issue about is there too much pressure put on by the Chinese government to extradite and vice versa, and I think people will argue that some sovereignty is given up. So I think these are the issues with bilateral treaties. Are laws exactly the same? Are they implemented the same way in China and the United States? And so I think it's not going to be an easy pathway. It's going to take some time for sure.
And also, the reason that we have very limited treaty is because, under certain leadership of Mr. Zhou, for example, since these officials are corrupted, they are going to use this loophole for their future. So therefore, there are no incentive for them to sign this as quickly as possible. Well, now, I think with a clear government, I think maybe it's easier to get this signed.
Yeah, integrity of the government is a very important precondition for signing such an extradition treaty with the U.S. But Michael, are you with us?
Yes.
What about the future of the illegal assets that the fugitives transferred abroad? What's going to happen to that?
That remains to be a big problem, because last time, about 10 years ago, Mr. Yu Zhendong the former executive Bank of China in Kaiping. He was extradited, but the biggest chunk of his illegally gained money still remain in the United States or remain to be nowhere to be found. So, in the future, that there has to be some talks and negotiations between these two countries. That if this lady is extradited to China, what about the leftover assets? I think that's going to be very problematic because in the United States, if you face the rule of law and there is a due process of what if Madam Yang can claim some of the assets are legally obtained, and they may be, still remain in the United States, even she was extradited to China. So I think that's going to be problematic. But for repatriation of certain criminals, I think it's getting easier because they always started with the immigration violation first.
Thank you very much for briefing us with your skeptical attitudes towards some of the assets, as well as on an equal footing, what would be done to reciprocate the U.S. side with regard to repatriation.
Can I add something on this? And I think for the economic crime in China, ever since the last amendment of criminal law, they are no longer subjected to death penalty. So this is one obstacle overcome with the last amendment of criminal law. Second, as to these assets accumulated in the foreign country, I think U.S., China, and China with many other countries try to negotiate a sharing scheme as to how much, if is the illegal income, how much will be kept by the U.S. government, how much will be expatriated to China, so that this give an incentive for U.S. government to take effort, because they are going to use quite some of their policing resources to deal with this issue, so therefore they want to get paid for.
Yeah, the other thing I just wanted to add about that too, about what happens in reality is that once someone is arrested, even on these kind of minor grounds, oftentimes banks which hold these assets will freeze these assets unilaterally based on their own agreement with a customer that if an investigation is underway. So the fact is that a lot of times these assets are frozen by the bank. It has nothing to do with the governments, but it actually is, I'm just talking about a practical aspect having dealt with these cases.
So, Mr. Tao, what do you think of the issue of human rights? Are you convinced that some of the economic fugitives whom the Chinese authorities demand repatriation would use as an excuse for them to not to be extradited back to China? To what degree do you think this would be accepted by the U.S. legal authorities in terms of legal asylum, and political asylum?
Well, I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, again, it's up for their lawyers to decide, and I think that obviously what lawyers are going to do, we have 1.3 million lawyers in America. They zealously advocate. They may take positions that are ludicrous, like family planning, and this might not be applicable, or human rights in some way, shape, or form, just as a tactic to delay the matters, even though we know that those are largely not defensible, but it would at least lengthen the matters, and you can plead generally in the alternative. And so, I mean, I think that it's going to be a lengthy process. It's not going to happen immediately, but it's going to signal at least the beginning of a dialogue with regards to these cases, and cases that come the other way, from China to the United States.
Thank you very much. You're watching Dialogue with Mr. Tao Jingdou and Mr. Edward Lehman. We're discussing how difficult it will be for 100 economic fugitives on China's blacklist would be brought back and brought to justice, with Madame Yang Xiuzhu topping the list. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us. Welcome back. At the APEC meeting convened in Beijing last November, members including the US, Canada, Australia decided to set up a regional law enforcement cooperation network known as the ACT-NET, or anti-corruption authorities and the law enforcement agencies, to snare corrupt officials and recover illicit assets. Do you think from then on remarkable progress has been made by parties to the agreement that more and more economic fugitives would be brought back? Do you think there's going to be a wider wider international cooperation here?
For me, it's merely a political willingness of those countries to work together. is a kind of long-term cooperation program, but try to get this mangling with their own country legal system and due process of law, I think is still going to take time.
Yeah, no, agreed. I mean, it's an agreement to agree in the future that maybe we might be able to work together. I mean, there are a whole bunch of things that aren't affordable in different countries that, for example, right to an attorney, right to silence. I mean, these are all issues that need to be discussed, and these are the details that will make this work or not work, and whether they want to drill down or not. And it's not going to be done immediately. Have there been remarkable changes? No. But the fact that they've started on change is what's significant here. How it's going to be applied and whether it will be applied even-handedly is another issue.
Given the difficulties and adversity of the legal circumstances, the huge difference between China and the Western legal system, what China should do next is to prevent and control the escape of the fugitives from China with a large amount of money, illegal money. Now, what can be done to prevent the corrupt officials from escaping and fleeing China?
I think the first thing we should do is to make sure that we have a system in place which will prevent anyone to get corrupted.
In other words, we got to institutionalize the current crackdown upon the corruption.
This is going to be a continued flow to the country. If you resolve the issue with the U.S. and Canada and Australia, they will go other countries where there are no extradition treaties. So unless you have a worldwide extradition arrangement, it's going to be still a headache for the Chinese government.
And I'm afraid as part of the enormous efforts to institutionalize the current crackdown upon corruption, assets or transfer of ill-gotten assets got to be cut off one way or another. Does that have a lot to do with the cooperation between China and Interpol to prevent organized economic crimes?
Yeah, I mean, what we have found, at least in practical measures of dealing with Interpol and these types of things, is that largely they're not enforceable, that it's just a notice is given. I don't know how it's been with your practice, but we haven't been able to seize bank accounts. We haven't been able to do things with regards to that. These are all great words, but when you actually, as a lawyer, try to put them together in cooperation with the governments, it's extremely difficult. So, I mean, these words are all great, but how it works as a practical person trying to seize money is extremely difficult. And so I think another thing that Tao Jianzhou said is good is God protects the protected, which means that there should be a system where it's more difficult, a check and balance in the system to be able to steal money or to be able to abscond with money, where not one person is in charge of that income and can flee, but a number of people have a check and balance. So that might be a solution as well. Let's prevent it before it goes abroad. But what they've got is a collision course. They've got this opening to the outside world. They've got this exportation of income and money and funds that are going abroad. They're buying many, many things. So I think, and then they're allowing visas and passports to be issued and visas to be issued for a lot of different countries. So now that's going to accelerate the problem, I think, at the same time. So we have China opening the outside world. Everyone's applauding that. China also, criminals going to the outside world also will happen at the same time. And so we have to find a way to stop that. And I don't think that that's really been fully discussed on how to do it on shore here in China.
Is it possible for an American economic fugitive to escape and to escape with a lot of illegal money from an industrial nation to a developing country?
Sure. Yeah, no, I mean, we had cases like this as well. I mean, this is exactly what Tao Jianzhou was talking about. Americans who wind up absconding with money, then they come to jurisdictions where there's no extradition treaty. The famous cases, one is the Great Train Robbery in London, where someone went to Brazil, and there's no extradition treaty between England, apparently, and Brazil, or there's no extradition if you have a child in Brazil. This person actually had a child. They couldn't extradite him until the child reached the age of 18, which was like 17 years. So that this happens quite a lot, yeah. But the places to run to are not so great.
Yeah, because all these, alleged criminals, they are smart, even smarter than ordinary people. So they know how to use all this legal, loophole, try to maximize their protection.
Let's take a second look at how the issue of corruption would be eradicated in terms of institutionalizing the crackdown. So what do you think are the necessary things that need to be done by the government, that need to be prioritized on the agenda of Mr. Xi Jinping to have a clean government here, other than the supervisory role of the media, independence of the judiciary? Well, these are very difficult things given the unique political institutions of this country, Edward. But do you have any therapy?
Well, I mean, I think, one is increasing the level of enforcement on all levels, not just the head level, but also within the police. I think that there's a certain level of being disgruntled on different levels with people. I don't think there's any magic bullet that can be had. I think that this whole process with educating people with law and the rule of law at a very young age is going to pay off in dividends in the future. It's going to be very difficult right now to turn it around. The ship is sort of on one direction, and now he's trying to turn it around. It takes some time. So I see it's
last year, Mr. Tao, the fourth plenary session of the 18th Party Congress of the CPC, the ruling party, was concluded with a document emphasizing on the rule of law. Everybody placed great expectations on the outcome, but still many people were left increasingly uncertain as to whether rule of law would be seriously respected with regard to institutionalizing the crackdown. For example, what about the control of the personnel at different levels of the judiciary scattered throughout the whole country? Would the personnel power would be subject to the local government? Or what about the assets and their salaries? If all these things are still subject to the whims of the local authorities, then it's extremely difficult for the judiciary to enjoy greater degree of autonomy or independence. Without independence, I mean, there would be still the rampant corruption issue, right?
Yeah, it's not only judiciary. You need autonomy of judiciary. That's written in the Constitution. But also, you need a lot of balance of power. You need supervision from media, public opinion, so that all these people have a power and possibility, therefore, to be corrupted will be watched carefully by media, by all the people surrounding them, by the whole system in place. I think only by this way you can try to minimize, if not to talk about eliminate, all the corruption.
The year before last, the urban trial of Bo Xilai, a former member of the Politburo, the highest decision-making body in Chinese politics, was engineered somehow to rivet attention about the determination to fight big tigers. Without the Western perception or understanding of independence of the judiciary, could China navigate its own independence course? You've stayed here in this host country for a number of years. So do you think we're going to find a third alternative?
Yeah, well, I think you have to, and I think that's the thing. We can't judge it by the old paradigm, by the Western paradigm, or by the old paradigm in China. I think it's a way of how do you get through this successfully. Now, having the Bo Xilai case on trial on the media and actually being televised was, I think, extremely helpful, and it sets a roadmap into what to take a look at. They were also doing WeChat information from it, and so it was quite a modern event. There was even an event in Taiyuan in Shanxi where they had people on trial as well, that they were showing some police persons. So I think these kinds of cases that are showing the public that there is some recourse for citizens who have had some corruption issues or problems with the government, that's very, very important to see.
Given your education as a lawyer by training, what lessons or inspirations can we draw from Hong Kong and Singapore? Because in both places you have the ICAC to enjoy independence, and their job is to be responsible for the chief executive officer of the Hong Kong ICAR government in the case of Hong Kong. And also high salary for the civil servants is yet another alternative, convincing enough, for example, to persuade the civil servants, look, you have to be very careful with the law. They have to respect the law, otherwise consequences would be devastating. So what do you think of Hong Kong and Singapore?
I think Hong Kong is certainly a good example to follow. I wrote, 2 months ago, an article talking about how we can learn from Hong Kong to, to a certain degree, forgive whatever in the past, and set up a really strict zero tolerance for the future on the anti-corruption front. Because for the last 30 years, we are kind of too fair play on the anti-corruption side. So therefore, a lot of cases have accumulated. So either you really haven't burdened by the past, or you focus currently and for the future. So you just have a very limited manpower to dealing with anti-corruption. And how to deal with the 30 years cumulative cases, you have to find out a way. Otherwise, you cleaned up the past, and now you have an ongoing case. They're going to have a new corruptions, so endless story.
I think this idea of having constitutional law cases may be an alternative as well, as opposed to having a check and balance where you're actually bringing a case based on the Constitution like we do in the United States, so then we would have many more people acting as watchdogs, not just a group of people, saying, hey, you didn't follow the Constitution, and this is a right I have under the Constitution.
There are always some radical liberals in China who call for democratization of the country, which is said to be the shock therapy, unless and until you practice liberal democracy and liberal market economy, you won't completely solve the issue of corruption. But do you think this is really the prescription, the only way, only remedy?
No, I think, as Ed said, if we put really the real teeth for the Constitution, I think we can, to the large extent, eliminate a substantial part of corruption.
So, in other words, we need to do a lot more to safeguard the spirit of the Constitution so that it's really something that will guarantee your seriousness and your attitudes towards the rule of law. Thank you very much for being with us. With that, we come to the end of this edition of Dialogue. Thanks a lot.